I need to say this before I start, because if I don't, you'll misunderstand everything that comes after. I didn't imagine it. I wasn't drunk. I wasn't dreaming. And I didn't panic and shoot at shadows in the woods like some idiot who watched too many horror movies. I stayed calm. I listened. I waited. And that's the part that keeps me awake now. Not the breathing outside the cabin, not the footprints I found at dawn. It's the fact that I stayed there all night, listening, knowing something out there was listening back. Because if I had just packed my gear and driven away when I first heard it, maybe none of what happened later would have happened at all. Maybe I wouldn't be sitting here months later trying to explain why I can't sleep in a room without windows anymore. The cabin sat deep in the mountains where the road stops being a road and turns into something more like a suggestion scratched through the trees. I'd rented it for a week because I needed the quiet. After 10 years working construction in cities that never really shut up, I wanted to hear wind in the trees again. The owner told me the nearest neighbor was 6 miles away, and the closest town had one gas station and a diner that closed before dark. That sounded perfect to me. When I arrived, the place looked exactly how you'd picture a backwoods hunting cabin. One room, old wood stove, a sagging porch, and forest stretching in every direction, like the world ended at the tree line. It smelled like pine sap and old smoke, the kind of smell that settles into the walls after decades of winters. I unloaded my truck, stacked some firewood inside, and spent the afternoon fixing a loose hinge on the front door because it squealed every time it moved. That sound bothered me. I didn't know why at the time. I just didn't like the idea of the door announcing itself to the woods every time I opened it. The first evening was peaceful. Wind moved slowly through the trees, and somewhere far away, a coyote started yipping as the sun went down. I cooked a simple dinner, sat on the porch with a beer, and watched darkness swallow the valley. It felt good to be alone, real alone. The kind of silence where your thoughts finally slow down because there's nothing left competing with them. Around 10, I went inside and latched the door. I didn't lock it at first. Out there, locking the door felt pointless. The woods don't care about locks. But sometime after midnight, I woke up for no clear reason. At first, I thought it was the wind shifting the trees because the sound was low and steady, a slow rhythm that blended into the background like distant surf. Then I realized it wasn't wind. It was breathing, slow, heavy. Close enough that I could hear the air move in and out like a bellows working just outside the wall. I stayed perfectly still on the cot, staring at the dark ceiling, trying to convince myself I was half asleep and hearing things. The sound came again. Inhale, long and deep. Then the slow push of air leaving lungs that sounded much bigger than anything I'd expect to find wandering around a cabin at 2 in the morning. I held my breath without realizing it. The breathing continued outside, steady and patient. And that's when I noticed something else that didn't make sense. It wasn't moving. If it had been a bear or a deer or even a curious coyote, I would have heard steps in the leaves, branches snapping, something shifting its weight. But whatever was out there stood in one place, breathing, as if it knew I was inside listening. I told myself it was probably a bear. Bears investigate cabins sometimes, especially if they smell food. That explanation helped for about 30 seconds. Then the breathing moved, not walking away, not circling. It moved upward. The sound rose slowly along the outside wall like something lifting its head toward the window. That window sat 6 feet off the ground. The breathing stopped directly beside it. I waited for the scrape of claws or the thump of an animal leaning against the wood. Nothing happened, just silence for a long minute. Then the breathing started again, closer now, like the thing had turned its head toward the glass. I remember realizing my rifle was leaning against the table across the room and feeling suddenly stupid for not keeping it closer to the bed. But I didn't move. Because something deep in my gut told me movement was exactly what the thing outside wanted to hear. So I stayed still and listened as the breathing continued beside that window for what felt like hours. Every so often it would stop completely. Those were the worst moments, when the air went silent and I knew whatever it was had stopped breathing, because it was listening. Around 3 a.m, the sound moved again. This time I heard steps, slow steps crunching softly in the leaves, as whatever had been outside the window walked toward the porch. The cabin had a wooden porch that wrapped halfway around the front. When the steps reached it, I heard the boards creak under weight. Not lightweight either. Each board groaned like someone heavy shifting their balance carefully. My heart started pounding because I knew exactly where those steps were headed. The front door? The breathing returned when the thing reached the door, right outside it, just inches away from the wood I'd repaired that afternoon. I could hear air moving through a nose or muzzle so close it sounded like someone standing on the other side of a thin wall. Then something touched the door, not scratching, not pounding, just a slow press like a hand or paw testing the surface. The hinge I'd fixed earlier gave a tiny squeak when the pressure shifted. The breathing stopped immediately. I realized then why that squeak bothered me, because now the thing outside knew exactly where the door moved. For several minutes, nothing happened. No breathing, no steps. Just a silence so thick it felt like the entire forest had paused to listen. Then the handle turned. Not violently, slowly, deliberately, like someone testing whether it was locked. And that's when I realized something that made my blood run cold. Bears don't turn door handles. The handle moved a few degrees before the latch stopped it. The door held. On the other side, the breathing returned, but now it sounded different. Not curious, not investigative. It sounded frustrated. The air pushed harder through whatever lungs were outside that door, faster and heavier than before. Then the porch boards creaked again as the thing stepped back. I heard claws or nails scrape faintly across the wood. And then something else. A low sound deep in the throat of whatever stood out there. Not a growl exactly. More like the beginning of one that never fully formed. The steps moved away from the porch and back into the trees. The breathing faded with them until the woods were quiet again. I lay there until the sky finally started turning gray through the window. When the first weak light touched the walls of the cabin, I forced myself to stand and grab the rifle. My legs felt stiff like I'd been sitting in freezing water all night. I walked to the door and listened for a moment. Nothing. Slowly I unlatched it and opened it, just enough to look outside. The forest looked calm. Morning mist hung between the trees, and birds had started making the small, cautious sounds they make before full daylight. For a moment I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Then I looked down at the porch floor. The boards were scratched with deep marks, like something heavy had dug its claws in while standing there. And the prints in the dirt below the porch steps were the reason I almost dropped the rifle. They were huge, bigger than any wolf track I'd ever seen. But they weren't shaped right for a wolf either. The front half looked like a canine print, with long claw marks pressed deep into the soil. But behind that was a heel, a long, human-shaped heel impression trailing behind the toes, like whatever left it had been standing upright. I followed the tracks with my eyes as they moved across the clearing toward the tree line. Each step was spaced far apart, the stride long enough that whatever made them must have been tall, much taller than me. At the edge of the trees, the tracks stopped abruptly, in a patch of rock where the soil disappeared. But something else caught my attention there. The bark on one of the pines was scraped nearly 8 feet off the ground. Fresh gouges cut into the wood, like someone had dragged claws down the trunk while passing by. I remember standing there in the cold morning air, trying to force my brain to fit those details into something logical. Bear, wolf, man, none of those explanations worked. And that's when I noticed the smell. It lingered faintly around the porch, wet fur, earth, and something metallic underneath it like old blood. The wind shifted through the clearing and carried the scent toward the trees. For just a second, the forest felt wrong again. Too quiet, too watchful. And I had the sudden sinking realization that whatever had been outside my cabin all night might not have gone very far at all. I should have packed my gear right then and driven back down that dirt road until the mountains disappeared behind me. Any sensible person would have looked at those tracks, smelled that smell, and understood the message the woods were trying to deliver. But the problem with being alone for too long is that pride starts whispering in your ear. Pride and curiosity. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the tracks just looked strange because the soil was soft. Maybe 2 animals had stepped over each other during the night and made the print look wrong. Maybe the breathing I heard had been echoing off the cabin wall and making something smaller sound bigger than it really was. I repeated those maybes like a prayer while standing on that porch, staring at the tree line. The forest didn't answer. It just stood there, tall and silent, like it always had. After a few minutes, the normal sounds of morning came back. Birds moving through branches, wind shifting pine needles, the distant call of a crow somewhere down the valley. Those sounds should have comforted me, but instead they made the silence from earlier feel even more unnatural, like the woods had held their breath during the night and were only now starting to exhale again. I stepped off the porch and crouched beside the prints to get a better look. Up close, they were even stranger. The toes were long, the claw marks cutting deep into the dirt like hooked knives, but that heel behind them was unmistakable. A long impression where weight had pressed down the same way a human foot would if someone walked barefoot through mud. Except no barefoot human had feet that big. I set my boot beside one of the tracks for scale, and the toes stretched several inches past the front of my sole. The stride between prints measured almost 5 feet. Whatever made them had been walking upright and covering ground in a way no normal animal could. That thought sat heavy in my stomach as I stood and followed the trail a few steps toward the trees. The soil ended quickly near the rocks, but the disturbed leaves told the same story. Something large had passed through there during the night, something heavy enough to press branches flat as it moved. I kept walking slowly, rifle held low but ready, eyes scanning between the trunks ahead of me. After about 20 yards, I stopped. The smell was stronger here, that same mix of wet fur and iron drifting faintly through the cold morning air. It reminded me of the scent inside an old hunting shed after a deer had been field-dressed, fresh and metallic and wrong somehow, when it hung in open forest instead of a place meant for it. I didn't go any farther. Something inside me finally pushed back against the curiosity and reminded me that following the tracks of a predator you don't understand is a good way to become part of the forest yourself. So I turned around and walked back to the cabin, The whole time I had the strange feeling of being watched from somewhere just beyond the trees. Not aggressively, not the way a stalking animal watches prey. It felt more like observation, like whatever had come to the cabin during the night was still nearby and simply studying what I would do next. That feeling stayed with me the entire morning. I made coffee on the stove and tried to focus on simple routines, like boiling water and cleaning a pan from the night before. But every few minutes my eyes drifted toward the windows. The forest looked normal out there. Sunlight slowly pushing mist away, wind moving through branches, nothing larger than a squirrel crossing the clearing. But the memory of that breathing wouldn't leave my head. The slow rhythm of lungs filling and emptying right beside the wall while I lay frozen in the dark. Around mid-morning, I decided the best thing I could do was stay busy. I grabbed my axe and started splitting a few more logs for the stove. The repetitive work helped clear my thoughts. Each swing of the blade biting into wood made the cabin feel a little less fragile. The sharp crack of splitting logs echoed across the clearing, and for the first time since waking up, I felt like the one making noise instead of the woods making it around me. That illusion lasted maybe 20 minutes. Then I heard something move in the trees behind the cabin. It wasn't loud, just a single branch snapping under weight somewhere beyond the brush. I stopped mid-swing and listened. Nothing followed the sound, no footsteps, no rustling. Just the quiet forest again. I told myself it was probably a deer stepping through the undergrowth. Deer were common in those mountains, and they moved quietly enough that you'd often only hear one branch snap before they froze and blended back into the woods. But the longer I stood there listening, the more the air around the clearing started to feel tense again. That same watchful pressure I'd felt earlier creeping back over the place. Slowly I lowered the axe and turned toward the tree line. The forest stared back without moving. Pine trunks rising like dark pillars between patches of sunlight. Underbrush thick enough that anything larger than a rabbit could hide in it without much effort. I waited another minute, then shook my head and went back to splitting wood. But I noticed something after that. Every time I raised the axe and brought it down, the woods stayed silent. No birds moving nearby, no squirrels chattering. It was the same strange quiet from the night before, only now it was happening in daylight. After a while, the silence started bothering me more than the sound of that branch snapping earlier. I set the axe down and walked around the side of the cabin toward the back wall. That's where the window was, the one the breathing had stopped beside. When I reached it, I saw something that made the hair on my arms rise instantly. The dirt beneath that window had new impressions in it. They weren't as clear as the prints by the porch because the soil was mixed with gravel, but the shape was close enough to recognize. Long toes, deep claw marks, and that same stretched heel behind them. The tracks were angled toward the glass like whatever stood there during the night had leaned in close. I looked up slowly at the window itself. The glass had a faint smear across it, barely visible unless the sunlight hit it at the right angle. I stepped closer and wiped part of it with my sleeve. The smear stayed. It wasn't dirt. It looked more like oil or moisture left behind by skin or fur pressing against the glass. And suddenly I understood something that hadn't occurred to me during the night. When the breathing stopped outside the window, it might not have been listening. It might have been looking in. I took a slow step backward from the cabin wall, rifle tightening in my hands without me realizing it. The trees behind me rustled softly as the wind moved through them, but the sound didn't ease the tension crawling through my chest. Because now the question in my head wasn't what had stood outside the cabin last night. The question was whether it had come back, and if it had, whether it was still standing somewhere in those woods watching me realize it. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at that smear on the glass like it might suddenly explain itself. The sunlight caught it at an angle, turning the faint mark into a dull streak that curved slightly downward, almost like something with a long muzzle had leaned against the window while breathing on it. That thought slid into my head without permission and immediately refused to leave. I forced myself to step away from the wall and scan the tree line again. Nothing moved. The forest had gone back to pretending it was ordinary. Wind in the branches, the distant croak of a crow somewhere deeper in the valley, the faint smell of pine warming under the sun. But now every shadow between those trunks looked deeper than it should have. Every patch of brush felt like it might be hiding something tall enough to stand above it. I walked slowly back around the cabin toward the front porch, keeping the rifle loosely raised. The clearing felt smaller than it had yesterday. The cabin, too, like both of them, had shrunk overnight, while the woods around them grew larger. I climbed the porch steps and paused at the door, glancing once more toward the place where the tracks disappeared into the trees. My mind kept replaying the sound of that handle turning in the dark. Slow, careful, curious in a way that animals usually aren't. That was the detail that bothered me the most. Curiosity implies thought, and thought implies something I wasn't ready to put a name to yet. I stepped inside and shut the door behind me, this time locking it without hesitation. The metal latch clicked louder than expected in the quiet room. I set the rifle beside the table but didn't move far from it while I ate a late breakfast. Every creak in the cabin made my head turn, old wood expanding in the sunlight, the faint ticking of the stove cooling down. Even the soft thump of my own boots on the floor sounded suspicious to my ears. It took almost an hour before my nerves settled enough that I could sit still without scanning the windows every few seconds. Eventually, routine started creeping back in. I cleaned my gear, organized the small pack I'd brought for hiking, and checked the map I'd pinned to the wall earlier that morning. There was a ridge about a mile north of the cabin that overlooked most of the valley. I'd planned to hike up there during the week to take some photos and enjoy the view. Part of me still wanted to go. Another part of me kept remembering the claw marks on the porch and the handle turning slowly in the dark. In the end, I compromised with myself. I told myself I'd just walk halfway to the ridge and see how the woods felt. If anything seemed off, I'd come straight back. That sounded reasonable enough in my head. So around noon, I stepped outside again, with the rifle slung over my shoulder, and started up the narrow trail that wound behind the cabin. The path wasn't much more than a game trail used by deer, and maybe the occasional hunter. It climbed gradually through thick stands of pine where sunlight filtered down in narrow golden shafts. The air smelled clean and cold up there. For the first few minutes, nothing felt wrong. Just quiet forest doing what quiet forests do. My boots crunched softly on fallen needles while the wind whispered through branches overhead. I even started to relax a little. The cabin disappeared behind me as the trail curved along the slope, and I found myself focusing on ordinary things again. Moss growing on rocks, the distant trickle of water somewhere downhill. But about 10 minutes into the hike, I noticed something that stopped me cold. The forest ahead of me had gone silent again. Completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, not even the constant background hum of insects you usually hear in summer woods. It was the same unnatural stillness from earlier that morning. I slowly unslung the rifle and listened. My own breathing sounded too loud. The wind moved the upper branches, but down at ground level the air felt thick and unmoving. Then I saw the first track. It sat right in the middle of the trail a few yards ahead of me, like it had been placed there on purpose. The same long toes, the same deep claw marks, and that long heel pressed into the dirt behind them. I crouched and studied it for a moment, hoping desperately that it might look smaller up close or somehow less real. It didn't. The print was fresh, too. The edges were still sharp where the soil had crumbled under weight. No leaves had blown into it yet. Whatever made it had stepped there recently, very recently. I slowly stood and followed the direction the track pointed. It led off the trail, into the trees on the uphill side of the slope. At first I didn't see anything else, just tangled brush and shadows weaving between trunks. Then I noticed something strange about one of the trees, about 30 yards away. The bark on its trunk was peeled back in long vertical strips, like someone had raked claws down the wood while standing upright. The highest gouge sat far above my head, 8 feet at least, maybe more. My mouth felt dry as I stared at those marks, because they weren't old. The exposed wood beneath the bark was pale and fresh, sap still glistening in thin lines where the cuts ran deep. I don't know how long I stood there before the feeling returned, that heavy prickling awareness crawling across the back of my neck, the unmistakable sensation that I wasn't alone on that slope. I turned slowly in a full circle, scanning every direction through the trees. The forest remained perfectly still. But the silence now felt different than before. Before it had been empty. Now it felt occupied, like the woods were holding their breath again. And then I heard it, a single exhale drifting from somewhere uphill behind me. Slow, deep, exactly the same sound that had pressed against the cabin wall during the night. My heart slammed against my ribs as I turned toward the sound, raising the rifle without even thinking about it. The trees on that side of the slope grew thicker, their trunks spaced close enough that shadows pooled heavily between them. For several seconds I saw nothing at all. Then something moved, not stepping forward, not charging, just a subtle shift of dark shape between 2 pines, about 40 yards away. At first my brain tried to interpret it as a trick of light. Maybe a branch swaying, maybe a deer standing half hidden behind a trunk. But then it straightened, slowly, and when it did, I realized the top of its head rose higher than the lower branches of the tree beside it. Tall, far too tall for any animal that should have been in those mountains. The shape didn't rush me. It didn't even fully step out into the open. It just stood there in the shadows, watching. I could barely make out details through the trees, but I saw enough to know the outline wasn't human. The shoulders were too broad, the neck too thick, and the head. The head had the long forward angle of a wolf's muzzle. The wind shifted slightly and carried that same smell down the slope toward me. Wet fur. Iron. Something wild and old that didn't belong anywhere near a cabin. I realized then that the rifle in my hands felt small, ridiculously small compared to the shape standing quietly in those trees. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I could feel its attention locked on me the same way you feel a flashlight beam on your face in a dark room. Then the creature tilted its head slightly to one side, almost like a curious dog trying to understand something unfamiliar. And that small, strangely thoughtful movement terrified me more than if it had charged, because it meant the thing watching me wasn't just an animal. It was thinking. And as it stood there, studying me from the shadows, I had the sinking realization that it might have been doing that long before I ever heard it breathing outside my cabin. For several seconds, I couldn't move. my body locked in place the way animals freeze when they know a predator has already seen them. The rifle felt heavy in my hands, but at the same time it didn't feel like protection anymore. It felt like a toy I was holding out of habit. The shape between the trees didn't advance. It didn't retreat either. It simply stood there watching me with the same quiet patience I had heard outside the cabin during the night. The distance between us wasn't far, 40 yards maybe. Close enough that if it decided to cross that ground quickly, I wouldn't have time to do much about it. My brain ran through the options anyway. Run back toward the cabin, fire a warning shot, slowly back away without turning my back. None of them felt like the right answer. Something about the way the creature stood there made it clear that sudden movements would only make things worse. So I did the only thing that felt even slightly reasonable. I slowly lowered the rifle a few inches and took one careful step backward. The creature's head followed the movement immediately, not with aggression, just attention. I could see a little more of its outline now through the trees. The shoulders were enormous, covered in thick dark fur that moved slightly in the breeze. Its posture was upright, balanced in a way that didn't belong to a normal animal. Wolves don't stand like that. Bears can rise on their hind legs for a moment, but they don't hold the position casually the way this thing was doing. This creature stood comfortably on 2 legs, as if it had done so its entire life. I took another slow step back. It remained where it was. The wind shifted again, and this time I caught a clearer scent of it, stronger now, wet fur, soil, and that metallic edge of blood. Not fresh blood exactly, more like the smell of something that had hunted recently. The creature lowered its head slightly, and for a moment sunlight slipped through the branches above it. Just enough light to reflect in its eyes. They weren't glowing like in cheap horror stories, but they did catch the light in a strange way, reflecting it with a dull amber shine that made them stand out in the shadows. And those eyes were focused entirely on me, studying, measuring. I took another step back toward the trail, then another. The creature still didn't follow. That almost made it worse. If it had lunged or growled, I would have known exactly what kind of situation I was in. But the calm observation made it feel like I was being evaluated rather than hunted. When my heel finally touched the narrow trail again, I stopped for a second. The cabin sat maybe 10 minutes downhill. If I turned and ran, I might reach it before the thing reacted. But the memory of how quietly it had moved during the night told me that outrunning it through the woods probably wasn't realistic. So instead I continued backing down the trail slowly, one step at a time. The creature watched me the entire way, its head turning slightly to keep me in view as branches shifted between us. I must have taken 20 steps before something changed. The creature moved, not toward me. It stepped sideways between the trees, shifting its weight with surprising grace for something that large. One long leg moved forward, placing its foot silently on the forest floor. The motion revealed more of its body for a brief moment before another trunk blocked my view again. I saw enough to confirm what my brain had already suspected. The legs were digitigrade, like a wolf's hind legs, bent slightly backward at the knee. The arms hung long and heavy at its sides, ending in hands or paws I couldn't see clearly from that distance. Its chest was massive, broad enough that it made the tree beside it look thin. When it took another slow step, it didn't close the distance between us. Instead, it began walking parallel to the trail, keeping pace with me from inside the trees. That realization made the back of my neck tighten instantly. It wasn't chasing, it was escorting, or herding. The two of us moved like that for several minutes, me backing slowly down the trail toward the cabin. the creature drifting through the forest to my left, always staying hidden enough that I could only see pieces of it between trunks. But I could hear it now, soft footfalls pressing leaves flat, the faint shift of branches brushing against fur. Once I even heard the slow inhale of its breath again, deeper and heavier than any animal I'd encountered before. Eventually, the trail curved downhill enough that the clearing around the cabin came into view through the trees ahead of me. Relief washed over me when I saw the roof. The distance between me and the door suddenly felt like the most important stretch of ground in the world. I kept backing down the trail until my boots finally stepped out into the open clearing. The moment I crossed that invisible line between forest and open ground, the creature stopped moving. I could feel it pause behind the tree line like it had reached the edge of some boundary it didn't want to cross. I turned my head slightly and looked back toward where I'd last seen it. At first I saw nothing, just shadows weaving between trunks. Then the shape stepped forward, just enough for me to see it clearly for the first time. It stood at the very edge of the trees, tall enough that the branches around its shoulders brushed against its fur. The creature's body was covered in thick dark hair, darker along the back and shoulders, lighter around the chest. Its arms were long, hanging nearly to its knees, and the head was unmistakably canine. Long muzzle, pointed ears rising above the skull, and those same amber eyes fixed on me with a calm intensity that made my stomach twist. Seeing the full shape all at once made something inside me go cold, because every instinct in my body told me I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. A wolf built like a man, or a man built like a wolf. Either way, it was standing upright at the edge of the forest, watching me with quiet patience. I didn't raise the rifle. I didn't speak. I just kept walking backward across the clearing toward the cabin door. The creature's gaze followed every step. When my back finally touched the porch railing, I climbed the steps slowly, without taking my eyes off it. The boards creaked under my weight, the same way they must have creaked under its weight during the night. That thought sent a chill through me I couldn't shake. I reached the door, opened it quickly, and stepped inside. Only then did I allow myself to shut it. The latch clicked into place, and I leaned my full weight against the wood for a moment, breathing hard. Through the small window beside the door, I could still see the tree line. The creature remained there, standing motionless among the shadows. It didn't try to approach the cabin. It didn't turn away either. It simply watched. Minutes passed like that. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, the creature stepped backward into the forest. The shadows swallowed its body piece by piece until only the faint outline of its head remained between the trees. For a second, those amber eyes caught the sunlight again. Then they vanished too, and the woods went quiet. But the worst part of that moment wasn't that the creature disappeared. The worst part was the realization that it had walked away on its own terms. Not because I scared it, not because the cabin protected me. It left because it decided the encounter was over. And as I stood there staring at the empty tree line, another thought slowly crept into my mind. If it could leave whenever it wanted, it could come back just as easily, especially after the sun went down. I didn't move from the door for a long time after it disappeared. My back stayed pressed against the wood like I was holding it shut with my body alone. The clearing outside looked normal again, almost offensively normal. Sunlight on the grass, wind nudging the branches, the kind of peaceful mountain afternoon that people drive hours just to experience. But I knew better now. I knew how quickly that calm could disappear the moment the forest decided to hold its breath again. Eventually, my legs started shaking from the adrenaline wearing off, so I pushed away from the door and locked it properly. Then I checked the windows one by one. There were only two, the one beside the door and the one on the back wall, where the breathing had stopped during the night. I pulled the small curtain across the back window, even though it barely covered the glass. For some reason, the thought of looking out there and seeing a face pressed against the pane made my stomach tighten. After that, I sat at the table with the rifle across my lap and tried to think clearly. The problem was, my brain kept replaying the same image over and over. That moment at the tree line when it stepped forward enough for me to see it fully, the height, the shoulders, the unmistakable wolf shape of its head. I'd spent enough time in the outdoors to know what wolves looked like. This wasn't one. It had some of the same features, sure, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too balanced, too aware. That last part bothered me more than anything else. The creature hadn't acted like a wild animal. It didn't rush. It didn't threaten. It simply observed, almost like it was curious about me, the same way I was curious about it. Except its curiosity came from the body of something that could tear a man apart in seconds. I sat there for nearly an hour, turning that over in my mind. At some point the wind shifted again, and I caught that faint smell drifting through the cracks in the cabin walls. Wet fur, earth, iron. My head snapped toward the door before I even realized I'd moved. The smell faded quickly after that, but it left my heart racing again. That was the moment I accepted something I'd been trying to avoid since dawn. The creature hadn't really left. It had just stepped far enough away that I couldn't see it anymore. I stood up slowly and walked to the window by the door, lifting the curtain just enough to look outside. The clearing remained empty. The tree line sat quiet in the afternoon light, but the feeling of being watched had returned, heavy and unmistakable. It pressed down on the place like humidity before a storm. I lowered the curtain and stepped back from the glass. The thought of staying another night suddenly felt like a terrible idea. Pride and curiosity had already pushed me further than common sense should have allowed, but leaving right then didn't feel simple either. My truck was parked beside the cabin. Sure, but the road that led out wound through miles of the same forest I'd just seen that thing walking through. If it decided to follow, or worse, block the road somewhere narrow, I'd be trapped in a metal box with nowhere to go. That possibility sat heavy in my chest. Ability sat. So instead I did the one thing that made me feel slightly less exposed. I prepared. I gathered every piece of firewood stacked outside and brought it inside the cabin. I checked the rifle again and laid out the extra ammunition on the table where I could reach it quickly. I moved the heavy chair from the corner and wedged it beneath the door handle so the latch couldn't be turned easily from the outside. While I worked, the sky slowly shifted toward evening. The light coming through the windows turned softer, more orange. Shadows stretched longer across the floorboards. With each passing hour, the quiet outside grew thicker. By the time the sun dipped behind the ridge, the woods had gone still again. That same unnatural stillness from the night before. I lit the stove and cooked a small dinner I barely tasted. Every sound outside made my head turn. A branch falling somewhere in the distance, leaves shifting in a gust of wind. Once I even heard what sounded like something stepping softly through the brush behind the cabin. But whenever I moved to the window and looked out, I saw nothing. Darkness came quickly after that. Mountain nights tend to swallow the light fast, once the sun drops below the ridges. Soon the only illumination inside the cabin came from the small lantern on the table and the dull orange glow from the stove. I sat there listening. Minutes passed, then an hour. The forest outside remained quiet, except for the occasional wind brushing the trees. For a moment I started to think maybe the creature had moved on after all. Maybe the encounter on the trail had satisfied whatever curiosity brought it near the cabin in the first place. That thought lasted right up until the breathing started again. It came from the same place as the night before, just outside the wall near the back window. Slow, deep, unmistakable. My stomach dropped instantly. The sound was so close it felt like it was inside the room. I didn't move at first. I just sat there staring at the lantern while that heavy inhale and exhale repeated itself over and over again. Eventually, I stood slowly and picked up the rifle. The breathing continued without pause, as if the creature already knew I was awake and didn't care. I walked quietly toward the back wall until I stood beside the curtained window. The sound was clearer here, each breath pushed against the glass, like the creature's face was inches away from it again. My hand hovered near the curtain for a moment, while my heart pounded hard enough to make my ears ring. Part of me wanted to yank it open and force the situation into the open, where at least I could see what I was dealing with. But another part of me knew the moment I did that, I might be looking directly into those amber eyes again, only this time with nothing but thin glass between us. Before I could decide what to do, the breathing stopped. The sudden silence felt heavier than the sound itself. I stood there waiting, listening. Then the floorboards on the porch creaked, one long, slow step, followed by another. The creature had moved away from the window and back toward the front of the cabin, toward the door. I turned and walked carefully into the center of the room, raising the rifle toward the entrance. The chair I'd wedged beneath the handle sat exactly where I'd placed it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I heard the handle move again, slow, careful, testing the latch just like the night before. The metal clicked softly against the lock. The creature paused after that, and then something happened that made every nerve in my body go tight. A sound came through the door, not breathing this time, not a growl. It was softer than that, rough and low, like a voice that hadn't spoken in a very long time. And the shape of the sound, the rhythm of it, felt disturbingly close to a human word trying to form. I stood frozen in the center of the cabin, listening to that strange, broken noise drift through the wood. And in that moment, a terrifying thought crossed my mind. The creature outside might not just be curious about me. It might be trying to communicate. The sound didn't come again right away. After that strange, broken attempt at something that almost resembled a word, the porch went quiet. I stood in the center of the cabin with the rifle raised, every muscle in my body locked tight. The lantern flame flickered slightly as a draft slipped through the cracks in the walls, and for a second the shadows across the room stretched and twisted like they were alive. Outside, nothing moved. I waited for the breathing to start again, but it didn't. The silence that followed felt heavier than any noise. Then the handle moved again, slowly, carefully. The metal turned until it reached the stop created by the locked latch, and the chair wedged beneath it. The door shifted a fraction of an inch before the resistance held it in place. The creature outside pushed just enough to test it, the same way it had the night before. But this time, instead of stepping back immediately, the pressure stayed there. I could hear the wood creak faintly under the weight pressing against it. For a moment I had the strange impression that the thing outside was leaning its full body against the door, feeling the strength of it, measuring it. Then the pressure eased. A low exhale slipped through the gap between the boards. Not angry, not frustrated, almost thoughtful. I tightened my grip on the rifle. Part of me kept expecting claws to rake across the wood or for the door to suddenly explode inward under a violent shove. But none of that happened. Instead, the porch boards creaked again as the creature stepped away. The sound of its weight moving across the planks traveled slowly along the front of the cabin, one heavy step at a time. Then the steps stopped directly beside the wall where the window sat. My eyes drifted toward the curtain covering the glass. The lantern light behind me probably made the fabric glow from the outside. If the creature was standing there again, it could probably see my silhouette moving through the room. That thought made my skin crawl. I stayed perfectly still. Seconds stretched into minutes, and then the breathing returned, not pressed directly against the glass this time. A few feet away, somewhere outside the wall, slow, deep, patient. The sound carried a strange rhythm now, almost deliberate, like it wanted me to hear it, like it was reminding me it was still there. My mind drifted back to the moment earlier on the trail when the creature had walked parallel to me, through the trees. The way it kept pace, the way it stopped exactly at the edge of the clearing, as if some invisible line had been drawn there. It hadn't attacked then. It hadn't even acted aggressive. It had simply watched. The memory made me lower the rifle slightly. That was when the sound came again, that rough, low attempt at something shaped like speech. This time it was clearer, though still mangled by a throat not meant for human language. A deep rasp pushed through the door, a sound broken into pieces, 2 syllables maybe. I couldn't make out what they were supposed to be, but they carried a tone that didn't belong to an animal. The realization sent a chill straight through my chest. Because if the creature could form sounds like that, even poorly, it meant it had listened to human voices before. Maybe many times, maybe for years. I swallowed slowly, my mouth suddenly dry. "Hello?" The word slipped out of me before I could stop it. The moment it left my mouth, I regretted it. My voice sounded small and fragile in the wooden cabin. Outside, the breathing stopped instantly. The silence that followed felt electric. I realized then that whatever stood outside had definitely heard me. Several seconds passed. Then a shape shifted behind the curtain, just the faintest movement against the fabric as something large stepped closer to the window. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. The cloth barely stirred, but I could see the outline now. Tall, broad shoulders rising above the frame of the window, the long slope of a head leaning closer to the glass. The lantern behind me turned that shape into a dark silhouette. For a moment the figure stayed perfectly still. Then the curtain moved slightly as something touched the outside of the glass, a slow drag downward. The cloth shifted just enough that a sliver of the window became visible beneath it. And through that narrow opening, I saw one eye, amber, reflecting the lantern light like dull gold. The pupil inside it narrowed slightly as it focused on me standing in the middle of the room. We stared at each other like that for what felt like forever, neither of us moving. Then the creature blinked, a slow, deliberate motion that made the fur around its eye shift slightly. The muzzle beside it pressed closer to the glass, flattening the curtain just enough that I could see the shape of its nose beneath the fabric. The breathing returned, fogging a faint circle on the glass behind the cloth. My hands trembled slightly as I held the rifle. I realized in that moment that I could shoot. One pull of the trigger would send a bullet through the window and into the creature's face, from only a few feet away. But something stopped me. Maybe fear of what would happen if the shot didn't kill it instantly. Maybe the strange calm in the way it was watching me. Or maybe the deeper instinct that told me pulling that trigger would change the entire situation in a way I couldn't undo. Outside the window, the creature tilted its head again the same way it had earlier on the trail. Curious, studying. Then that rough voice pushed through the glass again. A rasping attempt at a word. This time I almost understood it. The sound came out warped and broken, but the shape of it was unmistakable. Man. The syllable dragged slowly through the creature's throat like it was fighting the shape of its own mouth. I felt the air leave my lungs, because if that thing could recognize what I was, if it could say the word, then it meant something far worse than an animal had come to my cabin that night. It meant something out there understood exactly who I was, and it had come looking for me specifically. The word hung in the room like smoke, man, not clear, not clean, but close enough that there was no mistaking the shape of it. My brain struggled to process what I had just heard while my body stayed frozen in the center of the cabin. Outside the window, the amber eye remained fixed on me, unblinking now, studying my reaction the way a scientist might watch an experiment. The curtain shifted again as the creature adjusted its weight. Its muzzle pressed harder against the glass, flattening the cloth so the outline of its nose became clearer. I could see the fog of its breath spreading faintly across the window behind the fabric. Slow inhale, slow exhale. The rifle in my hands suddenly felt heavier than it had all day. The distance between us was barely a few feet now. If that glass broke, the creature's head would already be halfway inside the cabin. I forced myself to breathe slowly through my nose, trying to think instead of react. The creature had spoken a word. That meant it understood something about people, about language, maybe even about fear. And if it understood fear, then it might understand threat, too. I swallowed once and lowered the rifle just a few inches, keeping it pointed toward the window, but not raised directly at the eye behind the curtain. The creature's head tilted again when I did that. The movement was subtle but unmistakable. Curious, interested. That strange rasping voice came again through the glass, quieter this time, as if it was testing the shape of the sound. Man. The syllable stretched and warped as it passed through teeth that weren't built for speech. The sound sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air creeping through the walls. For a moment neither of us moved. Then something changed in the woods outside. It started with a distant sound far beyond the clearing, a howl, long and thin, echoing through the mountains like wind passing through a hollow pipe. Wolves, real wolves this time. I had heard them before in those mountains, but never this close to the cabin. The creature at the window reacted instantly. Its head lifted slightly, and the eye disappeared from the gap beneath the curtain as it turned toward the forest. The breathing stopped. The silence that followed lasted only a second before the howling came again. This time, several voices joined together, rising and falling in a chorus somewhere out beyond the tree line. I felt the hair on my arms rise as the sound carried through the valley. Outside the window, the creature shifted. The curtain moved as its shape stepped back from the glass. For the first time since the encounter began, I heard something close to irritation rumble deep in its chest. Not quite a growl, more like a frustrated vibration pushing through its throat. The porch boards creaked suddenly as the creature moved away from the wall. I turned slowly toward the door, rifle coming back up. Heavy footsteps crossed the wooden planks outside. Then they stopped directly in front of the entrance. My heart hammered so loudly, I thought it might give away my position, even though the creature already knew exactly where I was standing. The howling in the distance grew louder, closer, several wolves now, their voices bouncing off the ridges around the valley. For a brief moment, I wondered if that noise might drive the creature away completely. But the sound that came next erased that hope. Immediately. The thing outside the door answered them, not with a howl like theirs. The sound that tore from its throat was deeper, rougher, layered with something that felt almost like anger. It rose through the night air like a broken echo of the wolf's call, stretching longer and louder until the cabin walls vibrated faintly around me. When the call ended, the forest went silent again. Even the distant wolves stopped for a moment, as if the sound had shocked them into stillness. I stood there gripping the rifle while my pulse thundered in my ears. Outside the door, the creature shifted again. Then the handle moved violently, for the first time since nightfall. The metal jerked downward and slammed against the lock. The chair beneath it scraped slightly across the floor as the door rattled under sudden force. I stumbled back instinctively. The creature didn't stop there. Another heavy impact hit the door, making the entire frame groan in protest. Dust shook loose from the ceiling beams. The chair legs screeched as they dragged another inch across the boards. My finger tightened against the rifle trigger without me realizing it. A third impact struck the door, harder than the others. The wood cracked sharply along one edge near the latch. The chair tipped sideways under the pressure, and suddenly the barrier between me and the thing outside didn't feel solid anymore. Panic surged through my chest. I stepped backward toward the center of the room as another blow hit the door. The crack widened. Splinters popped loose around the latch plate. Then the impacts stopped. For one terrifying second, I thought the creature had simply stepped back to charge the door again with even more force. Instead, the silence returned. Heavy breathing seeped through the cracks in the wood. I held my own breath and waited, slowly, deliberately. The handle moved again. The weakened latch groaned as pressure pressed against it from the outside. The broken wood around the lock bent just enough that the mechanism began to slip. My stomach dropped as the metal slid free with a dull click. The door pushed inward a fraction of an inch, then another. The chair lay on its side now, useless. The gap widened slowly until cold night air spilled into the cabin. I raised the rifle fully and aimed at the darkness beyond the opening. For a moment nothing appeared, just shadow and the faint outline of the porch railing beyond it. Then something large shifted forward. A massive hand covered in dark fur wrapped around the edge of the door. The claws were longer than my fingers. They sank into the wood as the creature pulled the door wider. And then the head followed. The long muzzle pushed into the lantern light first. Thick fur, wet nose, rows of sharp teeth visible between slightly parted lips. The amber eyes fixed on me immediately as the rest of its towering body filled the doorway. It didn't rush. It stepped inside slowly, ducking beneath the frame as if it had all the time in the world. When it straightened to its full height inside the cabin, the top of its head nearly brushed the ceiling beams. Up close, the smell hit me harder than before. Wet fur and iron, and the deep musk of something ancient and wild. My hands trembled around the rifle as I stared up at it. The creature studied me for a long moment. Its chest rose and fell slowly, with each breath. Then that broken voice pushed through its throat again, louder now inside the room. "Man!" The word echoed faintly against the cabin walls, and in that moment, staring into those amber eyes only a few feet away, I understood something that filled me with a deeper dread than any attack could have. The creature hadn't broken into the cabin because it wanted to kill me. It had come inside because it wanted to be closer. The cabin suddenly felt too small to hold both of us. The creature stood just inside the doorway, its shoulders almost brushing the frame, its massive body filling the space where the night air spilled in behind it. Up close, It was even larger than it had looked in the trees. The fur along its chest was matted in places, darker where old stains had dried into the strands. Its arms hung low and heavy at its sides, the claws slightly curved like dull hooks that could easily punch through wood if they wanted to. But the most unsettling thing was still the eyes, amber, focused, calm. They moved slowly over my face, my shoulders, the rifle clutched in my shaking hands, studying me the same way it had outside. The lantern light flickered against its fur, casting long shadows across the walls. For a moment neither of us moved. Then the creature stepped forward. Just one slow step. The floorboards groaned under its weight. I flinched, and the rifle came up fully without me thinking. The barrel pointed directly at its chest now. The creature stopped instantly. Its head tilted again, that same curious movement I had seen earlier. It looked down at the rifle, then back at my face. Its nostrils flared as it pulled in a slow breath. The smell of gun oil must have been strong from that distance. "Stop," I heard myself say. My voice sounded thin and cracked. The creature didn't react to the word the way a person would. But it did freeze where it stood. Its gaze stayed locked on me. I realized then that its ears were slightly angled forward, like it was trying to catch every sound I made. The broken voice came again, softer this time. "Man." The syllable dragged through its throat with that same rough effort. Something about the way it said it felt different now. Less like a test, more like recognition. My finger tightened on the trigger. I didn't want to shoot. But the distance between us had shrunk to less than 10 feet. If it lunged, I might not even get a second shot. My heart hammered so hard it felt like it was vibrating the rifle stock. The creature took another slow breath and lowered its head slightly. The movement made its shoulders roll forward, the muscles beneath its fur shifting like thick ropes under skin. It leaned closer, not aggressively, almost cautiously, like it was trying to smell me better. The air between us filled with that wild metallic scent again. My mind screamed at me to pull the trigger. Every survival instinct I had told me the situation had already gone too far. But something about the creature's behavior kept stopping my finger from moving. It hadn't attacked. It hadn't even shown its teeth, except when the muzzle had pushed through the door earlier. Instead, it simply watched, studied, breathed. Outside, the wolves howled again in the distance. The sound drifted through the open doorway like a warning carried on the wind. The creature's ears twitched slightly at the noise, but its eyes never left me. Another step forward, slow, deliberate. The floor creaked again. Now it was only 6 feet away. My breath came faster. The rifle barrel trembled visibly. "Don't," I whispered, though I wasn't sure whether I meant it for the creature or for myself. The lantern flame flickered harder as a gust of cold air slipped through the open door. Shadows jumped across the walls, stretching the creature's outline into something even larger behind it. And in that shifting light I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Scars. Thin pale lines cutting through the fur along its chest and shoulders. Old wounds. Some long and jagged like claw marks. Others straight and narrow in a way that looked disturbingly similar to knife cuts. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Those weren't animal wounds. They looked like the kind of injuries something would get from fighting people, from hunting people. My hesitation vanished instantly. My finger pulled the trigger. The rifle exploded inside the cabin with a deafening crack. The recoil slammed into my shoulder as the muzzle flash lit the room in a burst of white. The bullet struck the creature high in the chest. I saw the impact ripple through its fur, like someone had punched it with a hammer. The creature staggered backward with a violent grunt that sounded half roar and half bark. It crashed into the doorframe, splintering wood as its weight hit the wall. For a fraction of a second, I thought the shot had dropped it. Then it moved again, faster than anything that size had a right to move. The creature lunged sideways instead of forward, slamming into the table and sending the lantern flying across the room. Glass shattered, oil spilled across the floorboards. The flame flared wildly as it hit the wood. I scrambled backward toward the far wall, trying to chamber another round. My hands fumbled the bolt as adrenaline made my fingers clumsy. The creature roared again, a deep, furious sound that shook the air in the cabin. It wasn't a clean animal roar either. There was pain in it, and rage. It shoved itself upright again, one massive hand clutching the spot where the bullet had struck. Dark blood soaked through the fur there, spreading quickly across its chest. For a moment its amber eyes locked onto mine again. But the curiosity that had been there before was gone. Now there was only fury. I barely managed to rack the bolt before it moved again. The creature surged forward across the room. I fired a second time. The shot went wild as it hit my rifle barrel with one massive arm. The weapon flew out of my hands and smashed against the wall behind me. The impact knocked the breath out of my lungs as its body slammed into me. The force sent us both crashing through the cabin door and out onto the porch in a storm of splintering wood. I hit the ground hard, my head ringing from the impact. The world spun for a second. When my vision cleared, the creature stood above me on the porch, breathing heavily. Blood dripped from its chest onto the boards. Its claws flexed slowly as it stared down at me. I waited for the killing blow. Instead, it did something I will never forget for the rest of my life. The creature looked at me, and that same broken voice pushed through its throat one last time. "Man." The word came out strained, almost wounded. Then it turned away, just like that. It stepped off the porch and disappeared into the darkness of the trees. The forest swallowed its shape within seconds. I lay there on the cold ground, staring at the empty tree line, while the flames from the spilled lantern began licking their way across the cabin floor behind me. By the time I realized the fire had spread too far to stop, the roof was already beginning to catch. I barely managed to crawl away from the burning porch before the heat forced me back into the clearing. I watched that cabin burn for the rest of the night. The flames climbed higher until the entire structure collapsed in a shower of sparks. The forest around me stayed silent while it happened. No breathing, no footsteps, no amber eyes watching from the trees. But as the last of the fire died down, and the first gray light of dawn crept across the valley, I saw something in the dirt at the edge of the clearing that made my stomach turn. A trail of huge footprints leading away from the cabin, and mixed with them, drops of dark blood marking the path where the creature had walked back into the woods, which meant the thing I shot hadn't died in that fire. It had survived, and somewhere out in those mountains, wounded and bleeding, it was still out there remembering the night it came to my cabin looking for a man. I didn't follow the tracks. I want to make that clear. Whatever curiosity pushed me to stay that first day had burned away with the cabin. By the time the sun climbed over the ridge that morning, all I wanted was distance between me and those woods. But the tracks were impossible to ignore. They started at the edge of the clearing where the creature had disappeared during the night, cutting across the damp soil where the firelight had melted frost into mud. The prints were the same shape I had seen before, long clawed toes, the stretched heel, the stride of something that walked upright but carried the anatomy of a predator. Between them, scattered like dark coins pressed into the earth, were drops of blood. Some were small, others smeared where the creature must have stumbled or dragged a hand against the ground for balance. The sight of it made something twist in my stomach. I had hurt it badly. I knew that much. The first shot had hit solid, But those tracks also told me the truth I hadn't wanted to admit while the cabin burned. It had still been strong enough to walk away. I forced myself to look away from the trail and toward the road instead. My truck was still there where I had parked it beside the clearing. The metal was warm from the heat of the fire, but otherwise untouched. Whatever that creature was, it hadn't bothered with the vehicle. It had only come for the cabin, only come for me. I climbed inside with shaking hands and sat there for a long time, staring through the windshield at the blackened ruin of the place I had slept just hours before. Smoke still curled up from the collapsed beams. The smell of wet ash drifted across the clearing, mixing with the lingering scent of burnt oil from the lantern. Eventually, I turned the key. The engine started with a low rumble that sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet valley. I half expected something to step out of the trees the moment the sound echoed through the woods. Nothing did. I put the truck into gear and began the slow drive back down the dirt road. Every bend in that road felt like a corner where something might be waiting. My eyes kept drifting to the mirrors, scanning the forest behind me for any sign of movement between the trunks. The woods remained still the entire time. No massive shapes pacing the road, no amber eyes reflecting in the glass, just mile after mile of pine trees stretching into the distance. When I finally reached the paved highway 2 hours later, the relief hit me so suddenly I had to pull over for a minute. I sat there gripping the steering wheel while the reality of the night settled into my bones. I told myself I would report it. Tell someone about the cabin burning down, maybe even mention the animal attack that caused it. But the more I thought about what I had actually seen, the more impossible that explanation felt. What would I say? That a wolf the size of a bear had walked into my house and tried to talk to me? No one would believe that, and if they did, the only thing they'd believe about me is that I'd lost my mind somewhere in those mountains. So I kept the story simple when I finally spoke to someone. A ranger station sat about 30 miles down the highway. I stopped there and told them the cabin had burned during the night after a lantern accident. They asked a few questions, wrote down some notes. One of the rangers said they would send someone up later to look at the damage. That was the end of it as far as they were concerned. I never mentioned the tracks. I never mentioned the breathing outside the walls or the hand wrapped around the door. And I definitely didn't mention the voice that said the word man, like it was something important. Months passed after that. Life slowly slid back toward something resembling normal. I returned to work. I slept in my own bed again. I told myself the whole experience had been some strange combination of exhaustion and isolation playing tricks on my mind. But there were things I couldn't explain away no matter how hard I tried. The first was the scar on my ribs, where the creature's claws had torn through my jacket during the struggle on the porch. The doctor who stitched it asked if I'd been attacked by a bear. I told him yes, because it was easier than trying to describe anything else. The second thing was the rifle. I had left it behind in the cabin when the fire started. The metal must have melted in the heat or collapsed under the burning roof. But the bullet I fired first had definitely struck something. I remembered the way the creature staggered when it hit, the blood soaking into its fur. And then there was the third thing, the one detail that never stopped bothering me no matter how much time passed. The creature never tried to kill me, even when it had the chance. Even when I shot it. That thought crept into my head more often than I liked, because it forced me to ask a question that still keeps me awake some nights. Why did it come to the cabin in the first place? The answer didn't show itself until almost 4 months later. It was late evening when I got home from work and found the package sitting on my front porch. No return address, just a plain cardboard box with my name written across the top in thick black marker. I assumed it was a mistake at first, maybe something delivered to the wrong house. But when I carried it inside and cut the tape open, my hands started shaking before I even reached the bottom. Inside the box was a single object wrapped in an old piece of canvas. The cloth smelled faintly of pine and smoke when I pulled it back, and lying beneath it was something I recognized instantly: my rifle, the same one I had lost in the fire. The wooden stock was scorched along one side, but the metal barrel was intact. Someone had cleaned the soot off most of it. Even the bolt had been carefully wiped down. I stared at it for several minutes before I noticed the second thing in the box: a piece of paper folded in half and tucked beside the rifle. My heart pounded in my chest as I opened it slowly. The handwriting on the page looked clumsy and uneven, like someone had struggled to form the shapes. But the word written across the center was clear enough that I felt the blood drain from my face when I read it. Man. Just that one word. Nothing else. No explanation. No signature. I stood there in my kitchen staring at that paper for a long time, while the evening light faded through the windows. Because there are only two possibilities that make sense to me now. Either someone found my rifle in the burned cabin and decided to play a cruel joke, or something else walked back into those ruins after the fire, picked the weapon up, and carried it all the way out of the mountains just to return it to the man who shot it. And if that second possibility is the real one, then it means the thing that came to my cabin that night didn't just recognize what I was. It remembers me, too.